Good evening, everyone. I wanted to go ahead and take some time and go over assignment 9.2. I was reviewing the homework and saw that the majority of the class was really struggling through variance analysis. So I was hoping by kind of going over the key topics, it'll just help to kind of understand the assignment a little better. And I've put a PowerPoint together to help you walk through that assignment. Start with variable overhead calculations. The homework is asking for two different types of variance analysis for variable overhead. One of the things that I want you to keep in mind is both fixed and variable overhead is going to be measured by direct labor hours. The first one, spending variance, we're going to look at the actual variable overhead rate minus the standard variable overhead rate times the actual hours. Now this is pretty cut and dry. The actual variable overhead rate is the actual overhead that was spent, and this is provided in the exercise, divided by the actual direct labor hours. So this is the concept of the tried and true expense. How much did you actually spend on variable overhead? And then divide that by the actual direct labor hours to give you an actual variable overhead rate per hour. Now you're going to deduct that from the standard variable overhead rate. So the assignment's going to tell you what variable overhead was budgeted at, and it's using a per hour calculation. Well, obviously that per hour calculation is going to be multiplied against the standard direct labor hours. So in the homework, it gives you an example of 0.25 direct labor hours per unit. Well, in the actual section of the homework, it talks about 10,000 units being made. Well, if 10,000 units were made and it's 0.25 direct labor hours per unit, then you would multiply those two together and you get an expected 2,500 direct labor hours as your standard direct labor hour. So if you divide what the total variable overhead budgeted by the standard direct labor hours of 2,500, you'll get your standard variable overhead rate. Now what we're trying to understand is, what is the difference between the actual variable overhead and the standard variable overhead rate? Did you pay more or did you pay less? And that's why you're subtracting the two, so that you can get the difference. So once you subtract the actual variable overhead rate minus the standard variable overhead rate, if you get a negative number, then you spent less. If you get a positive number, then you spent more. You're going to take that number and you're going to multiply it by the number of actual hours used to build the 10,000 units. And this is what we call our spending variance. Ultimately, we want to know, based on the number of hours that we used to make the 10,000 units, did we spend more per hour than we should have or less? The next calculation is the variable efficiency variance. The efficiency variance is going to estimate your hours, your usage. Did you take longer or shorter than you should have per the budget? So technically what we want to see here is, what were the actual hours? And again, remember that we're talking about direct labor hours minus the standard hours. And I gave you the standard hours in the earlier exercise. It states that we should take 0.25 direct labor hours per unit. If we make 10,000 units, then the expectation is the standard hours is 2,500 units. What is the actual hours compared to that? That difference will get multiplied by your standard variable overhead rate, which was also calculated in the exercise above. But just as a refresher, the standard variable overhead rate, remember, is your budgeted overhead at 2,500 hours divided by the 2,500 hours, the standard hours. So the total budget overhead cost divided by the 2,500 hours gives you the standard variable overhead rate. Here what we're trying to calculate is, did we use more time? Did we use less time? And what did that time cost us? So once you figure out, did you use more hours or less hours compared to the standard, what you should have used, you multiply that against your standard variable overhead rate and you get your total cost based on efficiency. If you used less hours, you're favorable. If you used more hours, you're unfavorable. For fixed overhead calculations, the scenarios are exactly the same, except now you're going to look at the fixed overhead standard rate. Remember that both fixed and variable are using direct laborers as the cost driver. So I would look in the budgeted section to determine, based on 10,000 units, how many hours should I have used per the direct labor, which is 2,500 hours, and what does that 2,500 hours cost me on my standard budget. For variable costing, it lists $2 per hour. What is fixed overhead costing list? In order to get our spending calculation, we need to know what is our actual fixed overhead spend, which is provided in the question, less the budgeted fixed overhead spend. The budgeted fixed overhead spend will be calculated using all the information at the top. You have the target number per the budget of direct labor hours times the fixed overhead rate. In order to calculate volume, you want to take your budgeted fixed overhead, which you calculated in the exercise right before this, and you're going to deduct that from your applied fixed overhead. Applied fixed overhead is the actual number of hours you used times the standard overhead rate. Just doing that basic math will give you the difference and your fixed overhead volume. The next question they're going to ask is the return on investment. This is fairly simple. All the numbers are provided for you. You're going to calculate the average operating assets between the 2 years. You are given the assets for 1 year, and right below it you're giving the assets for the next year. All you're going to do is a very basic calculation of the average between the two, and then you're going to divide the current year's operating income by that average. That will give you the return on investment. And really what you're trying to calculate here is the percentage of operating income in comparison to your operating assets. The residual income is the operating income minus the rate of return times your average operating assets. The rate of return is provided in the exercise. The average operating assets you just calculated in the question before. You're going to multiply those two and you're going to deduct it from the operating income. This will give you your residual income. And then finally we have the economic value added. That's your net income minus the cost of capital times the operating income. So you're going to multiply together the cost of capital, which is a percentage provided to you in the homework. You're going to multiply that percentage times your operating income, and you're going to deduct it from your total net income, and that'll give you the economic value added. I'm hopeful that this slide presentation will help everyone walk through the variance analysis much smoother than last week. If you still have additional questions after hearing this presentation and reviewing the slides, please feel free to email me or give me a call. I'd be more than happy to work with you. Thank you and have a great night.